January 20th, 1953. Inauguration Day. The White House. President Harry Truman is getting dressed in the private quarters, preparing for his last official act as president. In a few hours, he'll ride to the Capitol with his successor, Dwight Eisenhower, for the inauguration ceremony. Then, Truman will become a private citizen for the first time in 8 years. Truman knows his relationship with Eisenhower is strained. The 1952 campaign was bitter and personal. Eisenhower attacked Truman's handling of Korea, accused his administration of corruption, and essentially ran against everything Truman had done as president. Truman responded by calling Eisenhower a coward for refusing to defend George Marshall from McCarthy's attacks. Both men said things they probably regret. But today is supposed to be different. Today is about the peaceful transfer of power, about American democracy, about putting personal feelings aside for the good of the country. Truman has prepared for this day carefully. He's arranged for Eisenhower to come to the White House as tradition dictates. They'll have coffee together in the Red Room, exchange a few words, then ride together to the Capitol. It's what every president and president-elect have done for generations. Truman has even arranged a special gesture. He's ordered that Eisenhower's son, John, who is serving in Korea, be brought home for the inauguration. Truman thought this would be a gracious act, something that might ease the tension between them. At 11 a.m., Truman receives word that Eisenhower's car has arrived at the North Portico. Truman straightens his tie and prepares to go downstairs to greet his successor. This is the moment when personal animosity is supposed to be set aside for ceremonial dignity. But then an aide brings shocking news. General Eisenhower is not coming inside. He's sitting in his car outside, waiting. He sent word that Truman should come out to the car, and they'll proceed directly to the Capitol. Truman is stunned. In all of American history, no president-elect has ever refused to enter the White House before an inauguration. It's a calculated insult delivered on the most public day possible, a rejection of tradition and courtesy that everyone will notice. Truman's jaw tightens. His face flushes red. His aides can see he's furious. For a moment, nobody speaks. Then Truman says something that reveals his hurt and anger, words that will be remembered by everyone present. This is the story of what Truman said when Eisenhower refused to enter the White House. What happened during that frozen car ride to the Capitol, and how a personal feud overshadowed what should have been a moment of democratic unity. Let's go back to understand how the friendship between these two men collapsed so completely. Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower should have been friends. In 1945, Truman was president and Eisenhower was the victorious supreme commander who had won the war in Europe. Truman praised Eisenhower lavishly. He appointed him Army Chief of Staff. Later, Truman made him Supreme Commander of NATO. Truman even offered to support Eisenhower if he wanted to run for president as a Democrat in 1948. Eisenhower declined to run in 1948, and Truman went on to win his famous upset victory. The relationship remained cordial. Eisenhower continued serving in important positions under Truman. There seemed to be mutual respect between the president and the general. But by 1952, everything had changed. Eisenhower decided to run for president as a Republican. Truman was disappointed, but not initially hostile. The real rupture came during the campaign. The breaking point was the George Marshall incident. Senator Joseph McCarthy had viciously attacked Marshall, Truman's former Secretary of State and Eisenhower's mentor. McCarthy essentially called Marshall a traitor and a communist sympathizer. Eisenhower initially planned to defend Marshall in a speech in Wisconsin, McCarthy's home state. He had a paragraph written explicitly praising Marshall and rejecting McCarthy's attacks. Then Wisconsin Republicans pressured Eisenhower to remove the Marshall defense. They said it would antagonize McCarthy's supporters and cost votes. Eisenhower deleted the paragraph. When he gave the speech in Milwaukee on October 3, 1952, there was no mention of Marshall. Worse, Eisenhower appeared on stage with McCarthy, smiling for the cameras. Truman was outraged. Marshall had made Eisenhower's career possible. Marshall had promoted him over hundreds of more senior officers and given him command of D-Day. And now Eisenhower wouldn't even defend him from false accusations. Truman saw this as the ultimate act of cowardice and betrayal. Truman began attacking Eisenhower personally in campaign speeches. He called Eisenhower gutless. He said Eisenhower lacked moral courage. He suggested Eisenhower was willing to do anything for votes, even if it meant betraying the man who made his career. Eisenhower was deeply offended by these attacks. He thought Truman was making the campaign too personal. Every candidate makes compromises during campaigns. Why was Truman treating the Marshall Paragraph as if it was some kind of moral catastrophe? But there was another issue that angered Eisenhower even more. During the campaign, Truman attacked Eisenhower's brother Milton, who was president of Penn State University. Truman suggested Milton had been involved in the Japanese internment during World War II when he worked for the Agriculture Department. The attack on his brother infuriated Eisenhower. He believed Truman had crossed the line by dragging family into politics. By election day, the two men genuinely disliked each other. Eisenhower won in a landslide, carrying 39 states. For Truman, it felt like a personal rejection. His presidency, his policies, his party had been decisively defeated. The transition period between the election in November and the inauguration in January should have been a time to heal wounds, but even the transition became contentious. Truman invited Eisenhower to the White House for a briefing on November 18, 1952. The meeting was tense and formal. Eisenhower brought along several advisors, which Truman thought was inappropriate for what should have been a private conversation between outgoing and incoming presidents. During the meeting, they discussed Korea. Eisenhower suggested the war was going worse than Truman had admitted publicly. Truman defended his handling of the war. They argued. Nothing was resolved. Both men left the meeting frustrated and angry. Then in late November, Eisenhower made his famous trip to Korea. He had promised during the campaign to go to Korea if elected. He fulfilled that promise, touring the front lines and meeting with commanders. When he returned, he implied that the trip had revealed problems that Truman either didn't understand or had hidden from the public. Truman saw this as grandstanding and disrespectful. You don't criticize a sitting president's handling of a war while the war is still ongoing. It undermines the commander-in-chief and gives aid and comfort to the enemy. Truman was furious. By January 1953, the relationship had completely deteriorated. Both men were bitter. Both felt wronged by the other. Neither was willing to make a gesture of reconciliation. As Inauguration Day approached, Truman's staff worked on the schedule. Tradition dictated a specific sequence of events. The president-elect would come to the White House. He'd be greeted by the president. They'd have coffee or a drink in the Red Room. They'd exchange pleasantries. Then they'd ride together to the Capitol for the ceremony. This tradition existed for a reason. It symbolized the peaceful transfer of power that makes American democracy unique. Personal feelings didn't matter. Political differences didn't matter. On Inauguration Day, the outgoing and incoming presidents set aside their conflicts and demonstrated that the office was bigger than any individual. Every president and president-elect had followed this tradition, even when they disliked each other. It was a matter of respect for the office and the country. But Eisenhower decided he wouldn't follow tradition. He was still angry about Truman's campaign attacks. He was still resentful about the accusations of cowardice. He was still furious about the attack on his brother. He wanted to make a statement. Harry Truman would get no courtesy from Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower told his staff he would not enter the White House. He would wait in the car. Truman could come out, get in, and they would proceed directly to the Capitol. No coffee. No pleasantries. No pretense of civility beyond what was absolutely required. Eisenhower's advisors were worried. This would look petty. The press would notice. It would be seen as disrespectful not just to Truman, but to the office of the presidency itself. They urged Eisenhower to reconsider, but Eisenhower refused. He was going to make his point. Truman had treated him poorly during the campaign. Now, Truman would experience public humiliation on his last day in office. On the morning of January 20th, Eisenhower's car arrived at the White House at 11:00 a.m. Eisenhower sat in the back seat with his wife. Secret Service agents stood nearby. White House staff waited at the entrance, expecting the president-elect to come inside. But Eisenhower didn't move. He sat in the car, stony-faced, staring straight ahead. An aide approached the car. General Eisenhower was expected inside. The president was waiting. There was coffee prepared in the Red Room. Eisenhower's response was cold. "Tell President Truman I'm waiting in the car. He should come out." The aide returned to the White House and delivered the message to Truman's staff. There was a moment of shocked silence. Then someone had to go tell President Truman that his successor was refusing to enter the White House. When Truman received the news, his face turned red. According to multiple witnesses, his reaction was immediate and angry. Chief Usher J.B. West later recalled Truman saying, "He had to do it. He had to do this one last thing to insult me." Truman's press secretary, Roger Tobey, remembered Truman saying, "He's trying to humiliate me on my last day. He couldn't even give me this one courtesy." The most detailed account comes from Clark Clifford, Truman's close advisor. Clifford wrote that Truman said he'd been listening to those damn Republicans who'd been telling him he was some kind of crook. Well, he'll find out. He'll find out what this job is really like, and then he'll realize what I had to deal with. Truman paused, trying to control his anger, then added, "But I'll be damned if I let him see that he got to me. I'm going out there with my head up." Truman composed himself. He straightened his suit and told his aides, "Let's go. The country is watching, and we're going to do this right, even if he won't." Truman walked down the grand staircase and out to the north portico. Photographers captured the moment. His face showed strain, but he maintained his composure. He walked to the car where Eisenhower sat waiting. Eisenhower did not get out. He did not stand to greet the president. He simply sat there. Truman opened the car door himself and climbed in beside Eisenhower. The two men sat side by side in the back seat. Mamie Eisenhower and Bess Truman sat on the jump seats facing them. The car began moving toward the Capitol. The ride was excruciating. Witnesses later described it as one of the most uncomfortable moments in American political history. The two men sat in stony silence, staring out opposite windows. At one point, Truman tried to make conversation, mentioning the crowds lining the street. Eisenhower responded curtly. Truman then mentioned that he had arranged for Eisenhower's son, John, to be brought home from Korea for the inauguration. He hoped it might break the ice. Eisenhower's response was cold and cutting. "I didn't ask you to do that." Truman was stung. He had meant it as a gracious gesture. For the rest of the ride, neither man spoke. They sat in frozen silence as the car made its way through Washington. When they arrived at the Capitol, both men exited the car and observed only the minimum courtesy required. They sat near each other during the inauguration. There was no warmth, no reconciliation. After Eisenhower took the oath of office, Truman and Bess left immediately. Truman just wanted to go home to Missouri. On the train ride back to Independence, Truman was still angry. He told friends he hadn't thought Eisenhower had it in him to be that petty. In letters and interviews, Truman remained bitter, saying Eisenhower had insulted him on his last day as president. Years later, Truman would say he forgave Eisenhower, but never forgot. What Eisenhower did that day, he believed, diminished not just him, but the presidency itself. What Truman said when Eisenhower refused to enter the White House, those words of hurt, anger, and determination to maintain dignity, captures one of the most uncomfortable moments in presidential transition history. Two men who should have been able to set aside personal feelings for one day couldn't do it. And American democracy was diminished just slightly because of their inability to rise above their feud. This video presents historical events based on documented records, including memoirs, eyewitness accounts, oral histories, and scholarly research. Historical interpretations may vary among historians and scholars. Viewers are encouraged to consult multiple sources when studying this period of American history. This content is intended for educational purposes. Find stories like this as fascinating as I do, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Thanks for watching.